Hi, strangers. I want to give a quick warning before we start with today's story. This episode is especially gruesome and graphic. I try my best not to go into too much detail about some of the topics, but I just want you to know that today's episode deals with violence against children and animals, sexual assault, and cannibalism. Listener discretion is strongly advised. It's a bright, sunny day in Sacramento, California on January 27, 1978. Sacramento is the capital city of California and one of the more affordable cities in the Golden State. Its sprawling suburban landscape was perfect for growing families looking for somewhere safe and quiet to call home. One of the many modest houses nestled in this picture-perfect suburbia was 3207 Marywood Drive. A ranch-style home with a small driveway and a perfectly mowed lawn. The front entrance had a beautiful archway of ivy surrounding it. At around 11 that January morning, a 6-year-old girl named Tracy Grangard makes her way up the walkway to that ivy-covered entrance. She was wondering why her friend Jason was taking so long to come out of his house. She knew he was home because she just spoke to him earlier that morning, and she could see his mom's car in the driveway. 6-year-old Jason Miroth lived here at Marywood Drive with his newly divorced mother, Evelyn. Jason was supposed to go on a day trip with Tracy's family to the mountains to play in the snow. Tracy knocked on the door several more times, but still there was no answer. Eventually, she walked home and told her mother no one at the Miroth house was around. Tracy's mother decided to call the Miroth house in case they didn't hear Tracy's knocks. This trip was just confirmed with the Miroths that morning, so she found it odd that Jason wasn't ready to go. When she gets no answer, Tracy's mother hangs up and looks out the window at the Miroth house, and there's no longer a car in the driveway. It's at this point that Tracy's family decides to go on their day trip without Jason. Later on, Tracy and her family return from the mountains. As they are unpacking their car, another neighbor approaches the Grangard family about the strange lack of activity at the Miroth home. Remember, Evelyn was a single mother of a 6-year-old boy. The two of them were often seen out in the neighborhood. With this and the strange lack of response from the family that morning, the neighbors decide to go check on Evelyn and Jason. They check all the doors and find the back one unlocked. Nothing could have prepared them for what they found in that home. In fact, police would later call this scene absolute carnage and one of the worst crime scenes they had ever encountered. In the middle of the hallway leading to the front door lay a man with 2 bullet holes in his head. It was 51-year-old Dan Meredith, a neighbor and friend of Evelyn, who often helped her out around the house. That day, Evelyn was babysitting her 1-year-old nephew David, so Dan had come over to watch David and 6-year-old Jason while Evelyn took a quick bath. When the neighbors see Dan in the hallway, they immediately leave the house and call the police. When the police arrive, 2 more bodies are discovered. In the main bedroom, 6-year-old Jason had been shot twice in the head. His mother, Evelyn, was also shot in the head, but her body was in a very different state than her son's. In addition to being shot in the head, Evelyn was stabbed with a butcher knife multiple times. Her torso was carved open, and her organs were splayed out around her, completely mutilated. She had also been stabbed multiple times in the anus and uterus. Her face was covered in blood, and it appeared as though someone had unsuccessfully tried to cut out one of her eyes with a knife. Evidence also suggested she had been sexually assaulted after death. In the corner of the room was a crib for her nephew David. Police looked in the crib, only to find bloody sheets, but no baby. Police checked the house, but baby David was nowhere to be found. The scene was gruesome and confounding, but police were not as shocked as they could have been if it were not for the fact that they had just investigated a scene very similar to this several days earlier, in a house just like this one. Police now knew that this was the work of a serial killer who was more monster than man. This is the story of the Vampire of Sacramento, aka Richard Chase. Hi, strangers. I'll just say it. This episode is going to be a rough ride. We will be dealing with a lot of sensitive topics, and honestly, I had a hard time researching this case because of how gruesome it is. The Vampire of Sacramento popped up on my radar a couple of years ago, and I think I was hoping it would be more of a folklore story rather than a true crime one. But unfortunately, this story is 100% true, making it way more terrifying than any fictional vampire tale. So mentally prepare yourself, lock your doors, and listen closely. This is Stranger in the House. Sacramento detective Ray Biondi described the scene at the Miroth house as absolute carnage. With 1-year-old David missing from the house, he could only hope that the baby was still alive. To figure out who could have committed this heinous crime, the Sacramento police had to re-examine another murder scene they had investigated several days earlier, one they had written off as a random act of violence. On January 23rd, only 4 days earlier, another home invasion had taken place in a nearby Sacramento suburb. At 6 that evening, a man named David Wallen returned to his home after a work trip to Lake Tahoe, which was about 250 miles round trip. David had some car trouble on his way home and was returning home later than expected. But this is 1978, so David wasn't able to call his pregnant wife Teresa and tell her that information while on the road. When David walked through his front door, he found his German Shepherd sitting in the darkness and faint music coming from the stereo. He called out for Teresa, but there was no response. He found it strange that all the lights were off, but his wife had left the stereo playing. As he continued into the house, he noticed dark stains on the floor, which he initially mistook for oil, because they were so dark and thick. David then found a garbage bag full of trash lying ripped open in the hallway. David followed the dark stains to his bedroom that he shared with his wife, and in the doorway on the floor, David found her. Teresa's torso was split open and her intestines were pulled out around her. Her kidneys and spleen had been removed. One of her nipples had been cut off, and her underwear was around her ankles. Teresa's unborn child was also found nearby, removed from her body and mutilated as well. David said he began uncontrollably screaming and didn't even remember calling for help. The neighbors heard him and ran over to his house to see what was wrong. When Teresa's murder was first investigated, the Sacramento police believed that Teresa had known her killer and this was a crime of passion. But now, with the Miroth murder only occurring a few days later, police believed they were dealing with a serial killer. Criminal profiler Robert Ressler was called in to assist the Sacramento police during their investigation, and he created a profile of the killer. Ressler believed that the killer was a white male in his 20s and that he was suffering from mental illness. He believed he was suffering from mental illness due to how much evidence he had left behind. There appeared to be no effort to clean up or cover up the crimes. Ressler also theorized that the killer's mental health issues began around age 15 and had grown in severity over the past 8 years, to the point of committing murder. Police interviewed the neighbors of both the Wallens and the Miroths, and several neighbors mentioned that a strange man had knocked on their doors the day of the murder. They reported that a disheveled, long-haired man in an orange ski parka had knocked on their door and asked if they had any old newspapers he could have. The police created a sketch of the man in the parka and asked the public to come forward with any information they had on him. A few days after the Miroth murders, a young woman named Nancy Westfall was in the parking lot of her local grocery store. She was loading groceries into the trunk of her car when a disheveled man in an orange parka approached her. He asked her for a ride, but she was disturbed by his appearance. He was extremely thin with hollow eyes. Yellow crust encircled his mouth, and there were bloodstains on his shirt. So Nancy told him she could not give him a ride and quickly got into her car and locked the doors. As Nancy drove off, she knew she had to call the police. She remembered they were looking for a man in an orange parka. But then Nancy remembered something else. She knew that man in the parka. She hadn't recognized him right away because of his drastic change in appearance, but he was a classmate of hers in high school. And his name was Richard Chase. Police were able to locate the apartment of Richard Chase fairly quickly after Nancy's call. Police descended on 2928 Watt Avenue and were guided by the property manager to Richard's apartment. When they arrived at apartment 15, Richard refused to open the door. Police planned to wait Richard out. They pretended to walk away and give up on him, and then they waited in the hallway for him to leave. Which, yes, sounds like a plan out of a cartoon, but it worked. When Richard eventually left his apartment, police tackled him to the ground. As he struggled against the police, one of the detectives thought about shooting him because of how dangerous he thought him to be. But then he remembered that Evelyn, Miroth's nephew, baby David, was still missing. And Richard might be the only person who knew where he was. After Richard was in custody, police entered his apartment. And despite seeing the gruesome murder scenes at the Miroth and Wallen house, the police were not ready for what they found in Richard's apartment. The floor, the walls, and even the ceiling were covered in blood splatters. The sink, the countertops, and all the furniture were covered as well. The entire apartment was soaked in blood. Rotting organs belonging to both humans and animals were found in the kitchen. Several bloody dog collars were scattered around the room. Richard's utensils and blender were also covered in blood and viscera. Parts of a human brain were found in his refrigerator. He had an assortment of gun and psychology magazines, and a book titled Psychic People, and he had circled classified ads in newspapers about dogs for sale. On a calendar, Richard had written the word today on January 23rd, the day of the Wallen murder, and on January 27th, the day of the Miroth murder. He had 44 more future dates throughout 1978 with the word today on them, suggesting he was planning at least 44 more murders. Richard Chase was born on May 23, 1950, in Santa Clara County, California. His parents were Richard Chase Sr., a computer specialist, and Beatrice, a teacher. Richard and his parents moved to Sacramento soon after he was born. His sister Pamela was born a year later. By all accounts, Richard was a normal, sweet child in his early years of life. He played Little League, was in the Cub Scouts, and was well-liked by all his teachers. According to his sister Pamela, Richard was occasionally physically abused by their father, even citing an incident where he was thrown into a wall. Throughout their childhood, Richard and Pamela's parents constantly fought. Their father would abuse alcohol, and their mother would constantly accuse him of infidelity. Because of their fighting, they didn't pay much attention to their son, who was becoming increasingly disturbed as he approached adolescence. As Richard hit puberty, he became an extreme hypochondriac. Every few days, he believed he had come down with a new life-threatening ailment. At one point, he believed that his skull was slowly coming apart, and he could feel the bones under his scalp moving. He would constantly be touching his head, checking that his skull was intact. In addition to hypochondria, young Richard became increasingly fascinated with biology and blood. He liked to kill and torture animals that he found around the neighborhood, and open them up in almost a clinical way, examining their insides. At one point, he had killed so many pets in the neighborhood that the community began suspecting someone was stealing their pets from their yards and homes. In addition to hurting animals, Richard did two other things that are major developmental red flags in children. He was known to set small fires, and he often wet the bed. When these three behaviors are seen in a young child, they form what is called the MacDonald Triad. And according to some psychiatrists, when a child exhibits the MacDonald Triad, they are more likely to become violent criminals in adulthood. In 1963, a psychiatrist named John MacDonald was researching predictors of criminality. Basically, he was looking for behaviors in children that would indicate that they would become criminals later in life. The idea was that if psychiatrists could spot these behaviors early on, they could prevent a person's descent into criminality with therapy and treatment. Kind of like when someone shows early signs of an illness, it's better to get ahead of treatment, right? According to a paper in the American Journal of Psychiatry, written by MacDonald, titled The Threat to Kill, there were 3 key behaviors that were warning signs of a violent future. These key behaviors were bedwetting, animal abuse, and setting fires. MacDonald believed that if a child exhibited these behaviors, he was more likely to become a killer in adulthood. Now let's break down why he thought these behaviors were indicators of a violent future. According to MacDonald, continuous bedwetting after the age of 5 usually meant that the child was chronically anxious or stressed. And once they realized they wet the bed, the child would most likely grow embarrassed or scared to get in trouble with their parents. This would result in the child feeling an immense amount of self-hatred. According to MacDonald, fire-starting behaviors are said to be a physical manifestation of internal anger. He believed that this would be brought out by a child who feels like they have no control over something in their life, and feels a sort of kinship with something as out of control and destructive as fire. According to MacDonald, abuse towards animals is an indication that the person inflicting the pain has been humiliated or hurt, and now they're taking those feelings out on something more defenseless. It's about gaining power back that they feel they've lost. And many psychiatrists agree that animal abuse is often practiced for a much larger victim, like a human being, and killers often escalate from hurting animals to hurting people. Now, this theory that children will become killers if they exhibit these three behaviors is not perfect, and many scientists debate its validity. Obviously, there are children who exhibit these behaviors and don't become killers, and many killers never hurt animals or wet the bed when they were children. The Triad can't predict the future. What it does well, however, is show when a child is going through emotional turmoil, which untreated could lead to deranged behavior in adulthood. All this to say that Richard Chase was a disturbed child who exhibited the MacDonald Triad. In his teen years, Richard began to experiment with drugs like LSD, which only exacerbated his mental health issues. While using drugs, he became convinced on several occasions that his heart had stopped and that he was a walking corpse. During his later teen years, Richard had 2 girlfriends. Neither relationship worked out, though, because when it came time to have sex, Richard could not maintain an erection. His impotence massively humiliated him and caused a tremendous amount of self-loathing. Richard believed that the reason why he was impotent was because he didn't have enough blood in his body to maintain an erection. It was around this time that Richard began drinking the blood of birds and stray animals he killed around the neighborhood. He even tried to inject the blood of a rabbit directly into his veins with a needle, which resulted in him becoming extremely ill and needing to be hospitalized. After being brought to the hospital, he was institutionalized and diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. Paranoid schizophrenia involves delusions and hallucinations, which can include paranoid thoughts. During his stay in the institution, patients and orderlies nicknamed him Dracula because he was obsessed with blood. There were several times he was caught killing and drinking the blood of birds on hospital grounds. After some time in the institution and months of intense treatment, Richard was released into his mother's care. The psychiatrists and nurses believed that Richard was finally stable and was ready to go back into society. Unfortunately, they were very wrong. Soon after being released from the institution, Richard moved out of his mother's house because he was convinced she was poisoning him. After moving out, Richard was able to find a room in an apartment with a group of young men in the area, but the men found Richard strange and were very uncomfortable with his behavior. Richard was back to abusing drugs and alcohol and would often talk of his imagined ailments. The men asked Richard to move out, but he refused. Instead, other men moved out of the apartment, leaving Richard to live there on his own. Living by himself did not improve his mental state, and he began capturing and killing small animals again. He would eat them raw, or blend their organs in the blender with soda and drink the mixture. He would look in the classified ads for pets for sale that he could buy and then eat. In August of 1977, police found Richard in the Lake Tahoe area, covered in blood and holding a liver. They arrested Richard, but quickly determined the blood and organ belonged to a cow, not a human. At this point, there were not many laws protecting animals from such atrocities, so the police just let Richard go. It was around Christmas time of 1977 that Richard began his reign of terror as the vampire of Sacramento. His mother banned him from the house during the holidays because his behavior made everyone in the family uncomfortable. Richard was furious that his mother wouldn't let him come home. On December 29, 1977, Richard was driving through the quiet suburban streets of Sacramento when he spotted 51-year-old Ambrose Griffin helping his wife bring the groceries into their home. Richard looked at the man for only a few seconds before he reached down and pulled out a .22 caliber pistol. Without hesitating, he shot Mr. Griffin in the chest. Richard quickly drove off, and Mr. Griffin died outside his house, surrounded by the groceries and his screaming wife. Police initially believed that Ambrose Griffin was the victim of a random shooting, as no one had seen Richard drive away from the scene. While police wrote the shooting off as a one-time thing, Richard was desperate to kill again. Richard then spent several weeks knocking on random doors, looking for his next victim. But because of his disheveled appearance, no one ever let him in. On January 23, 1978, Richard was walking through a quiet neighborhood checking if doors were locked. Eventually, he found one that wasn't. Richard entered the home of 22-year-old Teresa Wallen. As I mentioned earlier, Teresa was pregnant and expecting her husband home later that evening. Richard had tried several other doors in the neighborhood before he came to one that was unlocked. He said he saw this as a sort of invitation to come in. It might be worth mentioning that perhaps Richard was fully embracing his vampire persona at this point. He was drinking animal blood daily, and the nurses at the institution called him Dracula. If you know anything about vampire mythology, or you have just watched too many vampire shows like me, you know that vampires are unable to enter a house without an invitation. This idea dates back to the 17th century. Leona Elacius, a Greek theologian and a patron of the Italian Renaissance, wrote about how mythical creatures couldn't harm citizens or their homes unless invited in. This rule reflects the idea that evil can't harm you unless you allow it to. It's a choice, an act of free will. By inviting a vampire in, you're metaphorically, and in this case, literally, letting darkness into your life. Perhaps Richard had read Dracula in the past and learned that vampires needed invitations to enter a home, and that worked his way into his delusions. Regardless of why he thought Teresa's unlocked door was an invitation, Richard entered her home and shot her 3 times using the same gun he used to shoot Mr. Griffin. He then mutilated Teresa's body with a butcher's knife he found in her kitchen, and then used an empty yogurt container he found in the garbage as a cup to drink her blood. Richard then engaged in necrophilia. Despite his impotence in the past, Richard's semen was found at the scene of the crime. Richard had brought gloves with him, but aside from that, he made no effort to clean up any evidence left behind. He committed his brutal crime and left. A few days later, Richard struck again. On the morning of January 27th, Richard was driving through Sacramento when he spotted 38-year-old Evelyn Miroth mowing her front lawn. Evelyn was a divorced mother to her 6-year-old son, Jason, and was babysitting her 1-year-old nephew, David. Evelyn had a lot on her plate that morning with the 2 boys, so she called her friend and neighbor, Dan Meredith, over to watch the kids while she took a quick bath. While Evelyn was finishing her bath, Richard made his way to her front door and found it unlocked. When he entered the house, he immediately encountered Dan Meredith in the front entrance hallway. Dan was shot point blank in the head once Richard spotted him. Richard stepped over Dan's body and made his way into Evelyn's bedroom, where he shot 6-year-old Jason and 1-year-old David in the head as well. He then shot Evelyn twice in the head, immediately killing her. Richard then went to the kitchen and grabbed one of Evelyn's butcher's knives. Richard cut her open, drank her blood, and removed several of her organs. Some of her organs were never found, suggesting Richard had eaten them. He tried to remove one of her eyes but was unsuccessful. Again, he sexually assaulted her corpse. As he was committing these horrendous acts, Richard heard a knock on the door. It was the little neighbor girl, looking to see if Jason was ready for their trip to the mountains. It is a small miracle that Richard panicked and decided to flee the house, rather than open the door to that little girl. Richard grabbed Dan Meredith's keys and the body of 1-year-old David. Richard took the baby's body back to his apartment, decapitated it, and then dumped it behind a church where it wouldn't be found for several months. Richard avoided apprehension for a few days until he bumped into one of his old schoolmates in the grocery store parking lot. Richard Chase was charged with 6 counts of murder in the first degree. During his trial, Richard's lawyers tried an insanity defense to get his charge lowered to 2nd-degree murder, which would take the death penalty off the table. And while Richard was very clearly mentally ill, the theory of him being too insane to know what he was doing was criminally wrong was rejected. Firstly, the crimes were premeditated, as indicated by the calendar in his home. Remember, he had the days of the murder circled. He also brought gloves to the crime scenes, suggesting that he knew police would look for his fingerprints. So while he was 100% mentally disturbed, he knew that what he was doing was wrong when he was doing it. I also just want to mention that Richard's mother, Beatrice, was also a monster in her own right. At Richard's trial, Teresa Wallen's husband David made a victim impact statement. Afterward, he was accosted by Richard's mother, who blamed the Wallen's dog for not protecting Teresa against Richard's attack. David was so stunned by this, but eventually asked why she didn't protect the public against her horrible son. On May 8th of 1978, Richard Chase was found guilty of 6 charges of first-degree murder and was sentenced to death by gas chamber. In December of 1978, he was sent to a prison for the criminally insane in California. During his time on death row, Richard continued to spiral into states of delusion. Richard believed Nazis, UFOs, and the mafia were all trying to kill him and poison his food. He constantly asked to be transferred to a prison on the East Coast so he could be closer to the government and protected from UFOs. On December 26, 1980, Richard Chase was found dead in his prison cell. Unbeknownst to the guards, he had been hoarding Synquin pills, which he was prescribed for his psychosis. The families of Richard's victims say his death did not give them closure. David Wallen suffered from night terrors long after he found his mutilated wife, Teresa. In an interview with The Sun, he said, "Each and every time I have to go right back to opening that door and walking into what I walked into." Teresa was a very innocent young lady who didn't deserve this, same as the other 5 people who died. Stay safe, strangers, and thanks for listening. This episode was written by Alexa Morrissey. Stranger in the House is a Boy Wonder production. All our sources will be listed in the show notes.